The airport is loud the way airports always are. Thousands of people, all going somewhere, all carrying too much. 3 people join the first-class boarding line. A father, 2 daughters, identical faces, identical tickets. A flight attendant approaches. She is smiling. The smile has every element: the eye contact, the tilt of the head, the practiced warmth. What it does not have is warmth. She asks to verify the tickets. Then she makes a turns. Them. And 3 people who paid for first-class seats are told, them, very politely, them, very professionally, them, that those seats are no longer available, them. 2 other passengers are escorted forward, into those exact seats. The father says nothing. He just looks at her. Steady, still. The look of a man who has been in rooms like this his whole life and knows exactly what just happened. One daughter watches the door close on the first-class cabin. The other daughter opens her laptop. Neither of them cries. That is the most important detail. Neither of them cries. They had a joke between them. Had, since they were 7 years old, standing in the hallway of their elementary school in Atlanta, while a substitute teacher stared at them both like she was trying to triumph over a math problem she hadn't studied for. The joke was simple. Whoever got mistaken for the other one first had to do the dishes that night. Selene won most days. Because Selene was quieter, stiller. The kind of person who could stand in a room and somehow not disturb the air around her. People looked at her and then looked away faster. Like their eyes couldn't quite find purchase on someone who wasn't performing anything for them. Noelle lost constantly. Because Noelle laughed too loud and moved too fast and had opinions about everything, including the temperature of other people's coffee. People remembered Noelle, sometimes before they even wanted to. Same for feet. Completely different gravity. Their father Edmund always said you could tell them apart in under 4 seconds if you paid attention. The trick, he said, was to watch what they did with their hands when they were thinking. Selene went still. Noelle tapped, always tapping, knee, table, whatever was nearest like. Her brain needed a physical outlet or it would overheat. Edmund Abara had watched those 2 girls grow up in parallel and never once mixed them up. Not once in 38 years. He was proud of that. He mentioned it more than he probably should have. The morning of the flight, he made eggs. This was the thing he did when something mattered. Not pancakes. Not the elaborate Nigerian breakfasts he sometimes made us on Sundays with fried plantains and enough pepper to make your eyes water. Just scrambled soft with too much butter the way their mother used to make them. Though he would never say that to part out. Selene noticed. She always noticed. She sat at the kitchen counter in Atlanta with both hands wrapped around her coffee mug and watched her father stand at the stove with his back to her, and understood exactly what was happening with either of them needing to say a word. This trip mattered to him, more than he was letting on. Noelle came downstairs at 7 minutes late with her laptop already open and one earring on a faint granola bar in her hand, and announced that she had just submitted a revised dataset to her MC3's research team from her phone in the shower and wasn't that impressive. Edmund turned from the stove. You have one earring. I'm making a choice. You're not making a choice. You forgot. Edmund, I'm a doctor of complex adaptive systems. I don't forget earrings. I deprioritize them. He put theirs in front of her. She ate them in 4 bites. Selene watched her sister and felt the familiar warmth of it. The ordinary specific warmth of this person who had her exact face and absolutely none of her stillness. They had been born 11 minutes apart. Selene first, then Noelle. As if Noelle had needed just a little extra time to build up enough energy for the entrance. They did not look like father. They had their mother's face entirely. Adaz Dabara, who had been a literature professor at Emory for 22 years before she got sick, who had read them, Toni Morrison and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Zora Neale Hurston, and insisted that stories were not entertainment but survival training. Daisy had been gone 5 years now. This was the first time Edmund Boyd planned taking something since then. First-class tickets, which was not a small thing for a man who had built his logistic in a storage unit in East Atlanta and still checked prices of everything twice before buying it. He had not told them why he chose first class. He didn't need to. They both understood. This was him saying something he didn't have words for yet. Something about the 5 years. Something about the 3 of them still being here. Something about his daughters being the kinds of women their mother had always known they would become. Selene had her Harvard faculty ID in her wallet. Noelle had just been named to a national advisory board on institutional systems design. Edmund had a newspaper clipping of each achievement in his desk drawer at home. Paper clipped together, slightly worn at the edges from being taken out in lifts and looked at more times than he would ever admit. The drive to Hartsfield Jackson was loud. Noelle talked about her research. Then about a podcast she'd been listening to. Then about whether airports would ever solve the fundamental lines problem of making people walk over a mile and a half much for a gate after passing 17 shops, saying things no traveler actually needed. Edmund said airports were fine. Noelle said Edmund's threshold for fine was concerningly low. Solène looked out the window and felt her wristband buzz lightly against her skin. The biometric research device she wore almost every day now. Part habit, part necessity. She was 3 years into a longitudinal study on implicit cognitive bias at Harvard's Neurological Research Center. The device collected ambient data continuously. Heart rate, galvanic skin response, ambient audio, fed into a system that helped map the neurological signature of specific social interaction. She had worn it so long she forgot it was there most days. She would think about that later. The airport was loud the way airports are. Specific organized chaos of thousands of people buzzing somewhere important, all slightly stressed, all carrying too much. Edmund had the tickets on his phone. 3 seats. First class cabin. Flight 215 to Chicago. Departing at 9:40 a.m. They checked the bags. Moved through security. Found the gate with 20 minutes to spare, which Noelle counted as a surplus victory given her recent earring-related setbacks. They sat. They waited. And then the boarding announcement came. First-class passengers, the gate agent said. Those requiring assistance. Families with small children. Edmund stood first. He straightened his jacket. He was the kind of man who straightens his jacket before doing things. Solène noticed that too. The small, precise rituals of a man who had learned that presentation mattered in ways that should not matter but did. They joined the line. And that is when Patricia Holt walked toward them. She was 54 years old. 22 years with Horizon Airways, led cabin and crew international routes for 16 of those years before they moved her to domestic. She had the walk for someone who had moved through airplane cabins for 2 decades. Efficient, contained, practiced economy of motion. She was smiling, the smile that Solène would later describe to a colleague as technically flawless, because it had every element. The slight lift at the corners, the eye contact held at precisely the right duration. The tilt of the head that communicated attentiveness. What it did not have was warmth. And Solène Barra had spent 11 years measuring the difference. Good morning, Patricia said. May I take a look at your boarding passes? Edmund held out his phone. Patricia looked at it, looked at Edmund, looked at Solène, looked at Noelle, and something happened in her face that lasted less than a second, and that most people in that line would never have caught. Solène caught it. Her wristband buzzed. Not an alert, just data being recorded, ambient audio, the specific acoustic environment of the boarding gate at 9:22 a.m. on a Tuesday in September. One moment, Patricia said, still smiling. There may be an issue with the ticketing system. It happens sometimes with premium bookings. Let me just verify. She stepped away. Edmund lowered his phone. Noelle looked at Solène. Solène did not look back. She was watching Patricia, watching the way the woman moved toward the gate desk, watching who she spoke to. Watching the angle of the conversation. The gate agent nodded, typed something, looked up once toward the 3 of them, then looked back down. Patricia returned. I'm so sorry for the confusion, she said. The smile had not moved. It seems there's been a ticketing error on your reservation. These seats have been reassigned. We can absolutely get you accommodated in economy with seats together, and I'll make sure to note the issue for a refund request. Edmund said nothing. For a moment, the entire gate felt quiet, even though it wasn't. We purchased first class, Edmund said. His voice was level, perfectly level, the kind of level that takes a lifetime to develop. I understand, and I'm so sorry. The system sometimes double assigns seats during upgrades. It's a technical issue on our end entirely. We purchased those seats 6 weeks ago. I completely understand your frustration. She did not understand his frustration. Noelle opened her mouth. Solène put one hand briefly on her sister's arm. Just once. Just a second. Noelle closed her mouth, and then it happened. Patria slightly stood soons. Just slightly. Enough that what she does next would not carry to the people standing 3 feet away in line behind them. She said it quietly, precisely, in the practiced tone of someone who had said something like it before, without ever having been held accountable for it. First class has a certain image to maintain. I'm sure you understand what I mean. Solane did not move, did not blink faster than normal, did not let such a thing show on her face that she did not choose to show. She was 38 years old. She had a doctorate from Johns Hopkins and a faculty position at Harvard. And she'd been the first black woman to lead a department's neurological research division. And she had been preparing for this moment, in some form or another, her entire life. She said, "I understand exactly what you mean." And then she stepped back. Edmund looked at his daughter. Something passed across his face, not surprise. Solane has suppressed that particular expression before. The expression of a man encountering something he had hoped his children would never have to encounter and finding it there in a oil-like thing that had always been waiting. They were moved to economy, 3 seats, middle section, row 27. As they walked down the jet bridge, Solane heard it behind them, the quiet, efficient sound of 2 other passengers being guided into the first-class cabin. 2 seats, 2A, 2B, 2C. Not too stiffen to look, she didn't need to. Noelle sat down in 27B with the specific stillness of a woman who is holding something very large very tightly and refusing to let it move. Edmund sat in 27A and looked out the window for a very long time. Salazar sat in 27C and became aware slowly of the device on her wrist. Still collecting, still recording. The ambient audio of a Tuesday morning at 9:22 a.m., including a woman's voice, quiet, practiced, precise, saying something it had said before. The flight was 2 hours and 40 minutes. No one at Aussie 20 said very much. That was unusual for them. Normally, on a plane with Noelle, you had to put headphones on. Noelle had thoughts about airplane snacks, some thoughts about the physics of turbulence, some thoughts about whatever documentary she'd watched the previous Thursday. Today, she looked at the seat back in front of her and tapped her knee exactly once and then stopped. Edmund read nothing. He had taken out a magazine when they boarded and held it open the whole flight, and Solane was fairly certain he did not read a single word. She spent the 2 hours and 14 minutes doing what she did when her brain needed to process something it hadn't been given a category for yet. She went clinical. She organized. She thought about Patricia Holt's face, the specific microseconds of expression she had caught before the performance locked back into place. She thought about the word that had been chosen. Not comfort. Not preference, image. She thought about the phrase certain standards and the way it hadn't been said but had been implied with the precision someone must learn exactly how much it could be communicated in negative space. She thought about 2 years, because that was what Noelle had found by the time they landed. She had her laptop open before the seatbelt sign went off, which was technically against the rules. And she had found Patricia Holt top level employment in approximately 22 years at Horizon Airways, which meant Patricia Holt had not invented anything on that jet bridge. She'd been practicing it for 2 decades. The thing about a practice, Solane knew, was that it required a system. You did not practice something in isolation for 22 years. You practiced it because the environment you were in made it possible, made it normal, made it the thing that was done and had always done and would continue to be done because no one has ever found a reason to stop. Called them that evening. He had not much since the airport, on the cab ride, at the hotel check-in, at the dinner that was supposed to be celebratory and was instead quiet in the way that families go quiet when something has happened and all of them are still finding the shape of. He called at 9 p.m. They were in Solane's hotel room. Noelle had brought her laptop and her remaining granola bar situation. They put the call on speaker. Edmund said, "Need to tell you both something." They waited. 15 years ago, I tried to acquire a regional carrier that was going under. I had the capital. I had the plan. I had letters of support from 3 free financial institutions. He paused. The acquisition was blocked by the Industry Oversight Board. The stated reason was procedural. But I had an attorney who told me privately that board members had flagged concerns about, quote, operational vision and alignment. She could never get me a name. I moved on. But I kept the documentation. Another pause. Tonight I started looking again. And I want you both to know that I intend to find out who was in that room. Because what happened today didn't start. And I think the full shape of the thing matters before we decide what to do about it. Noelle stopped typing. Solane said, "What do you want to do about it?" A long pause. "I want to ask my daughters that question first," Edmund said. "What do you two want to do about this?" Noel looked at Selene across the hotel room. Selene looked back, and for a moment they were 7 years old and again in a school hallway while someone tried to figure out which one was which. Except that they had never needed figuring out. Not to each other. Not to Edmund. There's always been I love myself regardless of what anyone looking from the outside thought they was fossil. I understand that's the system, Celeste said. How it works. Why it persists. What it would take to actually dismantle it at the root. Noel nodded slowly. I want to build something it can't survive. Something so well designed that the old way looks standing next to it. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then we have a plan. He hung up. Noel sat back on the hotel bed and at the ceiling. We're going to start on Airline, she said. He's going to start on Airline. We're going to help him design it. Same thing, very different liability. Noel laughed, finally. The loud, specific laugh that belonged entirely to her, regardless of what face it came out of. And Selene felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. A thing that had been pulled tight since 9:22 a.m. Not gone, not resolved, but loosened enough to breathe around. She looked at her as the device was still there, warm against her skin, recording nothing now, just waiting, the way it always did between significant moments. She thought about the file sitting on a server at her Cambridge office. An audio file, time-stamped, ambient, unremarkable looking, on dozens of similar files. She had not mentioned it to Edmund, had not mentioned it to Noel, had not mentioned it to anyone. Because it was evidence of something she was still deciding what to do with. And because as that decision felt like that should not be made in a hotel room at 9 o'clock at all, no, when you were still in the saw closet that's been worn on the plane. She would think about it more carefully. About all of it. Selene pulled her knees up to her chest and sat in the quiet of the hotel room and thought about a woman who had spoken 11 words into the practice who says them while never once been asked to explain them. And she thought about a system, not a person, a system, because that was of the things that most people got wrong. They went looking for the villain, the bad actor, the one who had decided on a given wanting to be cruel, and sometimes that person existed. But more often what existed was something older and less visible and far more durable. A practice, a protocol, a 22-year-old unspoken agreement about who belonged where and who had the authority to make that determination and how to do it without leaving anything that could be challenged. Patricia Holt had not invented this. She had inherited it. And that Solis Bian's understanding was in some ways the more disturbing fact. Because you could fire a person. You could discipline a person. You could make an example of a person. But a system did not care about examples. A system just kept running until someone built something better to replace it. Noelle had fallen asleep on top of the hotel comforter with her laptop beside her and one earring still on. Edmund was probably still awake 2 floors down. Stiff his thoughts the way he always did when something large was being processed. Quietly, thoroughly, without any of it showing on the outside until he had finished deciding what he thought. Solange turned off the bedside lamp, sat in the dark, and thought about her mother's handwriting on a note card that was still in her kitchen drawer at home in Cambridge. A line from Alison Morrison's essay that Adese had written out and involved into her when she started her doctorate. The function of freedom is to free someone else. She had been 23 when her mother gave it to her. The light from Noelle's open laptop cast a pale glow across the ceiling. Tomorrow there would be decisions to make, phone calls to consider. A father downstairs with a plan that was a plant and yet needed 2 orders with very specific skills to become something real. But tonight Selena just sat in the quiet and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened at 9:22 a.m. Not just the anger, not just the humiliation, but underneath both of those things, the thing she was still excavating, a kind of grief. For all the people who had felt this exact wobbly and not had a research file on a Cambridge server, not had a father with capital and connection, not had a sister asleep on the next bed who would wake up tomorrow ready to redesign an entire industry before breakfast. She felt that. And then she made herself a quiet promise. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind you said out loud. Just a quiet internal rearrangement of priorities. One that would in 3 years, she doesn't think an industry has existed for decades was impossible. But that was later. Tonight that was just the dark and the soft sound of Noelle breathing. And somewhere on a server in Cambridge, an audio file. Wait. The first thing Edmund bought was a whiteboard. Not a company, not a fleet. Not legal counsel or aviation consulting or the services of the very expensive industry analyst. Noel had already identified and sent a preliminary email to it 7 in the morning without telling anyone. A whiteboard, 6 feet wide, delivered to his Atlanta office on a Thursday. He set it up himself, which took longer than it should have because the mounting brackets were labeled with instructions designed by someone who had really never mounted anything in their life. Noel called while he was doing it. How's the airline business? Currently, I'm building flat pack furniture. Foundational skills. He got the whiteboard up eventually, and then he stood in front of it with a marketer for a long time without writing anything. Because the thing about building something is that you have to ask first about what you're actually building.
Not the version you tell investors. Not the version you tell the press.
The versions you admit to yourself at 6 in the morning in a room with a whiteboard and no audience. He wrote one word in the center. Compass. Then he drew a circle around it. Not because it was a great logo concept. Because a compass did not tell you where to go. It told you where you were. It told you the truth about direction, regardless of you wanted the direction to be. So that was probably the right and same something built on the premise that the truth about how you treated people was always visible to the people being treated. Even when you thought it wasn't. Even when you were very practiced at the performance. Especially then. He stood back and looked at the word. Then he uncapped the marker again and wrote, much smaller, in the bottom right-hand corner, Flight 214, September. Year 0.
He would leave it there the whole time. Through every meeting and every setback and every night he seated in that office past 10 o'clock. It would get faded and he would retrace, it would get faded again.
Year 0. 3 months after the hotel room in Chicago, Celine submitted a research amendment to her Harvard joint chair. She was expanding her longitudinal bias study to include institutional systems analysis in commercial aviation. She needed access to operational data from multiple carriers. She needed 2 additional research assistants. She needed a large data collection apparatus. She also needed to delay her spring sabbatical by 1 semester. Her department chair read the amendment and looked up at her over his reading glasses. This is a significant expansion. Yes. The aviation component is quite specific. It is. He looked at her for a long moment. Personal? Celine looked back at him with the exact expression she used when a question had an obvious answer she was choosing not to confirm out loud. He approved the amendment. Noel did not need to amend anything. Noel operated in the perpetual state of someone who was already working on 17 things and could simply begin working on 18 without visible disruption to any of the other 17. She had started building the operational framework for Compass on a shared document that she had titled, with characteristic Noel energy, "Do not open this if you are easily overwhelmed." And opened it. He was overwhelmed. He called her. There are 47 tabs. Those are just the primary tabs. There are sub-tabs. He closed the document, made coffee, opened it again. The core of what Noel was building was this, a service system in which the quality of human interaction was not determined by ticket class. You could have different seat sizes, different meal options, different boarding fees. All of that was logistics, space and resources allocation. But the way a staff member made eye contact with a passenger, the way a question was answered, the way a person was addressed when something went wrong. None of that should change based on what row you were sitting in. That was not idealism. That was design. And Noel Ibarra had a doctorate in complex adaptive systems amongst DRZ's patients for the argument that dignity was a resource too limited to distribute evenly. She had that argument as a various forms her whole career. She found it, as she told Edmund on a Tuesday afternoon phone call, logistically illiterate. Edmund wrote logistically illiterate on the whiteboard under Compass and left it there for 6 weeks. Meanwhile, across the country, Patricia Holt was learning something. She was just learning what it felt like to be on the other side of a desk. Horizons had not fired her. That was the thing people got wrong when they heard the story later. They assumed she had been immediately and dramatically dismissed. A clean consequence. That was not what happened. What happened was slower and more deliberate. They moved her. First from international to domestic. Then from domestic long haul to short haul. Then from senior cabin crew to standard cabin crew. Which came with a memo about restructuring and operational efficiency, and can contain nothing that could be appealed because nothing in it was explicitly punitive. Then from cabin crew to ground operations. That one arrived with no memo at all. Just a special choice, a new uniform, and a supervisor both obvious younger than her, who called her Patricia in a tone that made the name sound like a minor inconvenience. The quiet restructuring took the better part of a year. She processed boarding passes.
She answered questions about baggage fees. She said of a credit flight approximately 142 times a day to people who did not look at her when she said it.
She did not understand at first why this felt different from the professional reassignments. She had moved between roles before. She was adaptable. She prided herself on adaptability. But there was something about the counter, about standing on the service side of it, something she could not immediately name. It took her 3 weeks to find the word. Invisible. She was invisible. Not in a dramatic way, in the specific mundane way of someone whose function is recognized and whose presence is not. People looked at the counter, at the screen, at the boarding pass in their hand. Threw her to the gate behind her. She processed 140 departures a day, and she could count on one hand the number of people who had looked her in the eyes. She drove home on a Thursday and sat in her car in the driveway for a long time before going inside.
Not doing anything. Just edging off. The cold coming in. She thought also about
eyes, about the quality of not being looked at. And then, she sensed her will, not like something surfacing from water she had thought was still. She thought it about 2 women in a boarding line. Same face, both of them. She had looked at both of them and made a calculation so fast she had not registered it as a calculation. It had felt like professional instinct. She sat in the car and for the first time allowed herself to consider that the pattern she spent 22 years recognizing was not real. She went inside. She resigned from Horizon 2 weeks later. Not dramatically. No speech. She turned in her access badge and walked out of the operations building for the last time. 22 years. She carried out 1 box. She stood by her car in the parking lot, thought that 1 box was either a sign of remarkable efficiency or evidence that she had left very little of herself in that building. She applied for jobs.
Found one at a budget hotel near the airport. Front desk. Which was ironic in a way she preferred not to examine too closely. She was good at it. Professional. And warmer than she had expected to be. Because in a hotel with a 3-star rating, what people mostly needed was to be seen. Not managed. She was working on that.
She was honestly a work in progress. Which brought her a Monday morning in October, 11 months after she had taken the hotel job. She was behind the desk at 7 a.m. when the glass doors opened and a woman walked in.
Rolling suitcase. Laptop, bag already open.
Mid-sentence on a phone call, she was fishing as well simultaneously again over a revolving door, which was ambitious. Patricia recognized her.
Not the one she thought about more often.
Noelle. The one who had been about to say something to the jet bridge before her sister put a hand on her arm. Patricia did not move. Noelle finished her call, looked up, their eyes met.
Something passed across Noelle's face, recognition, something more complex behind it. It's
I have a reservation, Carter, under the company
on account.
Carter, a work alias.
Filed away.
Patricia pulled up the reservation. Of course, she said. Room 412, checking out Wednesday, Noelle said. She took the key cards and walked toward the elevator without looking back. Patricia stood at the desk and processed the next guest, and the one after that, and the one after that. That evening she drove home. Sat in her car in the driveway for 23 minutes. Not doing anything. Just sitting with the specific weight having been treated by someone she had wronged, as an ordinary person doing an ordinary job. No confrontation, no acknowledgement of the past, no punishment and no mercy either. Just room 412, please. Thank you. She did not sleep well. She thought about the word she had used on a jet bridge. Image. The word she had slid quietly, deliberately, in the tone she through wetlights of observation and approval, and being called excellent while doing the very specific thing she had been doing. She had called it professional instinct. It was not instinct. It was habit. And somewhere in the years since she had learned the difference, that knowledge had been quietly rearranging something inside her. Not loudly, not with resolution, just rearranging.
Captain Airways received provisional operating certificates 16 months at Edmonds in front of a blank whiteboard in Atlanta.
16 months, which anyone in commercial aviation would tell you was either a miracle or evidence of someone who had been the most prepared person in every room he walked into for 38 years. In Edmund Arbara's case, it was the latter. The team they built started it at the 30 pole, then 80. Then, by the time the first Compass aircraft was configured and ready for its inaugural run, just over 200, they hired from everywhere. From other carriers, from hospitality, healthcare, which Noel had studied extensively because healthcare had confronted its own bias reckoning and developed interventions worth examining. Solane had completed the first phase of her expanded study by then. The preliminary data confirmed what she had suspected. The problem was not individual bad actors. The problem was environmental, systemic. These implicit bias patterns she measured as divisional carriers were not aberrations. They were consistent, repeatable, reinforced daily by structures built without ever questioning the assumptions underneath them. You could not fix that with a 2-hour sensitivity training. You had to go into the architecture for the environment and rebuild it from different assumptions. And she called the program the Cognitive Recalibration Protocol, which was accurate but not particularly exciting as a name. So Noel renamed it internally as the Rewire, and it stuck. 6 months. Not a workshop. A curriculum built on neuroscience, on research showing that implicit bias was not fixed, responsive to environment, repeated counter stereotypical exposure to systems that interrupted automatic pattern recognition before it became action, measured before and after with instruments, not surveys. Surveys measured what people thought they believed. Instruments measured what their nervous systems actually did. The Compass employee went through it, including Edmund. He did not argue about this. He sat in the same sessions as his ground crew and came home 3 weeks in told Solane on the phone that he had learned something about himself he was not entirely familiar with. Good. That's your response? That's the point of the program, Dad. He was quiet. Your mother would have made this mandatory for the whole neighborhood. She would have made it mandatory for the HO of Toy. Oh, he laughed. The laugh he saved for things that were both funny and sad at once. The inaugural Compass flight departed on a Tuesday morning 18 months after Flight 215. Edmund stood at the gate and watched the aircraft push back. He did not make a speech. He just stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the aircraft move and didn't see anything. Noel stood beside him and said nothing either, which for Noel was extraordinary. Then Noel's 7 lifted. And Noel said, "Oh, send Thomas." Edmund says, "I know. All of I know." They went back inside. The first 3 months of Compass operations produced data that made Solane's research team stop and read the numbers twice. Passenger satisfaction scores across all ticket classes were clustered in a range that traditional carriers only achieved in first and business. Incident reports involving obvious complaints were a fraction of the industry average. Staff rations in that 6 months was 30 points above the sector norm, and the lowest priced seats showed the sharpest improvement over comparable industry benchmarks. Because those were the best where the growth between fell and and what dignity actually every fell historically been widest. The system was working, not because it was inspirational, because it was the behind, which was when the campaign started. A trade newsletter item, sourced anonymously, about unverified concerns in Compass's new cabin configuration. Then a regional business piece about whether a startup carrier's focus on, quote, social priorities might be coming at the expense of operational rigor. Then a national feature. Can you build an airline on values alone? The tone was not hostile. It was something more effective than hostile. It was skeptical in the way that felt reasonable, in the way that guided readers toward a conclusion while appearing to offer balance. It read it twice, called Noel. It's not accidental. Well, it was quiet for a moment. I have candidates, I'm narrowing. She narrowed it to 2 within a week, called Edmund. He listened. Do not speak for a moment. Don't narrow further, he said. I already know who it is. Noel. It's someone you know. Silence. Dad. I know, he said quietly. I know who it is and I'll handle it. Both to keep building. Don't let this pulse your eyes off the work. Noel put the phone down and stared at the ceiling. She did not push further. Not because she agreed with him, but because she knew her father well enough to know something deliberately. And when he was carrying it, it's in the wrong direction. This felt like the right direction, even if she didn't like it. So she opened a new tab, 48 now, and kept building. The campaign ran for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Compass brought his advance bookings dropped 19%. Two investors called to express concern. Edmund listened to all of it with the patience of a guy who had been in some trying impossible for 30 years and had built his career on doing it anyway. Then he called a meeting. He stood at the Compass headquarters whiteboard. Different room from the Atlanta office. Same kind of whiteboard. Yeah, because some tools you just kept using until they stopped working and this one hadn't stopped yet. We are not going to defend ourselves against noise. We are going to be so clearly and measurably excellent that the noise becomes irrelevant. The research. He looked at Hélène. Where are we? Selene had a binder. Physical, because Edmund processed things better on paper, which Noel found baffling and had stopped arguing about. 3 years of data, neurological measurements, pre-and post-program, behavioral observations, incident reports cross-referenced against 11 comparable carriers. Statistical significance that would hold in any peer-review contest. We publish sense, and we do it alongside operational data. So there's no gap for anyone to narrative into. Edmund looked at Noel. Noel was looking at her laptop. 2.5 weeks, she says. Maybe 2.25 if Everson stops asking me questions while I'm working. Edmund wrote 2.5 weeks on the whiteboard. Then below it, trust the design. Outside the conference room windows, a Compass aircraft had sat on the tarmac in morning light, white and still and waiting. Noel stopped looking at her laptop. 2.25, she said. 2.25, Edmund agreed. And somewhere across the country, Patricia Holt was driving to work on a Tuesday morning. Think about the word invisible. Think about 23 minutes in a driveway. Think about a woman who had given her room 412 in an ordinary voice and expected nothing back. She pulled into the hotel parking lot, went inside, stood behind the desk, and when the first guest came through the door, she looked at them before the creep jump had not to assess, not to categorize, just to see them, like a person. Which was such a small thing, which cost absolutely nothing, which was, she was slowly understanding the whole thing. The paper came out on a Thursday, not a press release, not a carefully managed media rollout with pre-briefed journalists and embargoed quotes. And then kind of horrible reveal that made the interview suspicious. Someone was controlling the story harder than the story deserved. Just a paper. 41 pages. Peer-reviewed. Published in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience with the quiet authority of something that was entirely sure of itself. That was precise. Completely undramatic. Institutional bias mitigation through environmental redesign. A 3-year longitudinal study in commercial aviation.
Lead author, Dr. Selene Ibarra, Harvard Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. Co-author, Dr. Noel Ibarra, MIT Department of Complex Systems. The same morning, Noel published the Compass Operational Framework online. All 47 tabs, annotated.
With implementation guides for organizations of any size. Available free of charge under an open access license. She had faded the free part longer than she should be anything else in the 3-year process. Because free meant no barrier. Zonalization could say the cost was prohibitive, or the access too complicated, or the time not run right. Free meant the only remaining excuse was choice. And Noel Ibarra did not have a great deal of patience for institutions choosing badly and calling it circumstance. She posted it at 6 in the morning. By noon it had been downloaded 14,000 times. By 3 in the afternoon, 52,000. She refreshed pages more times than she would admit in any professional context. Edmund at 4. No, I thought, 61,000, I'm looking at the whiteboard. How does it all look? He was quiet for a moment. Finished, he said. It looks finished, which was not the same as over. Finished meant it had become what it was supposed to become. Finished meant every number on that board, every crossed out deadline, every retraced line in the corner that said year 0, had accumulated into something real enough to stand on its own. Edmund had driven to the Compass headquarters at 7 that morning. Gone to the conference room, stood in front of the whiteboard and read it the way you read something that was complete. 0. Still. There, grew this assertion from being retraced so many times. Trust the design. The timeline in Noel's handwriting, revised 3 times, ending in 2 1/4 weeks, underlined twice. He did not add anything, just read it. Then he said something he said to no one, just to the room. We did it, Days. He stood a moment longer. Then he opened the right desk drawer and took out 3 things he kept there. The newspaper clipping of Selene's first faculty appointment. The photograph of Noelle at her MIT doctoral ceremony. The handwritten note from Adezeze that he had found in his jacket pocket 6 months after she'd died. Put there so long before that neither of them could have said when. He placed the actual rejection letter from 15 years ago beside them, in the right drawer, with the things that reminded him of why he started. Not the trash, because that letter's part of why he started, and he did not want to erase the why. He wanted to keep it where he could see it if he needed to remember. Then he picked up the phone and called both daughters together. I need to tell you something, he says. Something I should have told you before now. The person behind the press campaign, Edmund said. I told you I was handling it. What I didn't tell you was who or what I found when I looked. Noelle said nothing, which meant she had the tabs open. His name is Walter Greer, Edmund said. He was my operations director for 11 years before Compass, at the logistics company. I trusted him more than almost anyone in my professional life.
What I did not know for 30 years was that Walter had a history with Horizon Airways that predated me. He sat on the industry oversight board 15 years ago as a Horizon-affiliated representative. A silence. He was the vote, Susan said quietly.
He was the vote? The one my attorney could never get a name for. When I started up Plus and it began threatening the kind of order he had spent his career helping to maintain, he went back to his old relationships at Horizon and offered to help manage the problem. Another pause.
I found this out 8 months ago.
8 months, Noel said.
Dad, I know. I'm telling you now because you deserved the full shape of it. I didn't tell you then because I didn't want Compass built on top of anger at a specific man. What we were building was larger than Walter Greer.
Selene said, What did you do with it? Gave everything to my attorney. She filed a formal complaint with the industry oversight body. Walter resigned from his current board position 2 months after the filing. The review is ongoing. He paused.
I'm all asking for you to be fine with how I handled this. Assassin to know the truth of it.
The silence after that was different. Not tense. Not relieved. Just the silence of 3 people standing on the other side of something large, still finding their footing. Then Noelle said,
Patricia Holt. Edmund, what about her?
She's in this story somewhere. The way you're telling it. Walter had Horizon connections, board influences, a history with all of it. But she's not connected to Walter. She was just the first who doesn't get.
Yes,
Edmund said. So when you found Walter, you confirmed she wasn't part of the board history.
correct.
Patricia Holt had nothing to do with the oversight vote 15 years ago. She was cabin crew. She inherited a system. She didn't architect it. Selene had thought this, had known it, in the neurological and structural way she knew things. But hearing it confirmed out loud by her father settled something she hadn't realized was still unsettled. She knew your name when she saw it on the news, Noelle said.
Why?
Edmund's quiet for a moment. Horizon was not a large world. My acquisition attempt was not quiet. It was rejected, but it was not quiet. People inside that industry knew about it. Patricia Holt had been with Horizon 16 years to Berlin. She knew the name Robert Ibarra had tried to buy in and been stopped. She just didn't know why he'd been stopped or who had stopped him. She recognized you as someone Horizon had history with, Selene said. That's what I believe, yes. Noelle absorbed this. So she watched you build Compass and knew, at some level, that she was part of what had started it. I think so, Edmund said, though knowing that is different from knowing what to do with it. They sat with that for a moment.
Mom would have told us to Walter on door 1, Noel said finally. But to have told me about Walter on door 1 and then shown up at his office with documentation and a very specific kind of smile.
Both daughters laughed, low and layered with everything that laugh contained. She really would have, Selene said. I know. Edmund's voice was steady. I'm not her. I handled it differently. And I'm sorry I made you carry incomplete information for 8 months. You were protecting us, Noelle said. I was, which was not entirely my call to make. Another silence, the comfortable kind. 89,000 downloads, Noelle said. I saw, Edmund said. It'll cross 6 figures tonight. I believe you. The hospital network in Minnesota called again. I'm meeting with them next week, and the school district in Ohio. Noelle paused. You're going to be very busy for a retired man. Anything about retired? She laughed, the real one.
Edmund held the phone and listened to it and did not say what he was thinking, which was that it sounded exactly like her mother. He didn't need to say it.
They both already knew. While Edmund sat in the conference room with the finished whiteboard, Solène was standing at a podium in Harvard's Sanders Theater. The room was full in the way. Rooms were full when something had already happened, and everyone present understood they were there to have it formally named. Researchers,
Government researchers,
corporate representatives who had flown in that morning, students in the back rows who had heard about the paper through channels that moved than any official announcement. She had given many talks. This was the first one that felt like a closing argument. She did not start with the methodology. She started with a boarding gate. She said, "On a Tuesday morning in September, my sister and I were removed from seats we had purchased on a commercial flight. The stated reason was a ticketing error. The actual reason was communicated to me privately in 11 words. The room was still. I was wearing a biometric research device that I use daily for ambient data collection. It was running that morning as it ran every morning. It captured the full acoustic environment of that interaction. The file exists, timestamped, peer-reviewed in its selection methodology. The audio is clear." She paused. "I chose not to use it as in litigation. I made that choice deliberately, and I would make it again. Because a lawsuit names one person in one moment. What I heard in that recording was not a person making an individual decision. It was a system doing exactly what it had been designed to do. And a system does not respond to individual accountability. It responds to redesign." Pause. This paper is the redesign.
Killing any became for the question of listening if institutions implement its life from consumers to the humans and the advice and opinions from humans as deserved, they should be treated as fully human before they had done anything to earn it. She looked out at the room.
The data will answer whether it works. I'll let the data speak. She clicked to the first slide. The data was what it was, which meant it was undeniable in the way only things measured precisely over time could be undeniable.
The Rewire program produced statistically significant changes in implicit bias markers.
Not self-reported, neurological. Stable at 3-year follow-up with less than 4% regression. Compass passengers' satisfaction across all ticket classes clustered in ranges traditional carriers as only achieved at the top.
Incident reports
A fraction of the industry average. Staff retention at 6 months 30 points above sector norm. And the sharpest improvement in the lowest priced seats. Because that was where the gap between expectation and dignity had historically been widest. And Compass had closed it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. And it was not. She stepped back from the podium and felt, for the first time since the Tuesday mornings in September 3 years ago, that the weight of that morning had been turned into something that would outlast the morning itself. Not erased. Which was the whole point. Across the country at almost the same hour, Noelle was at her desk at MIT with her laptop and a coffee gone cold twice and 3 tabs running, reading responses to the framework publication, with the focused attention of someone watching something they built move through the world under its own momentum. The hospital NERC in Minnesota had submitted a formal implementation inquiry. A school superintendent in Ohio had written a 2-page letter starting with, "I have been waiting for something like this for a ends." A company in Seattle that had nothing to do with aviation had sent in 3 lines. "We make software. We have 800 employees. We have the same problem you solved. Connie talk." Noelle forwarded the Seattle email to Solène. Solène voice all back. "Your call. Mine was always operations. Yours was always a science. Stop deflecting." Wrote, "You deflect differently. You just do it faster so people don't notice." Noelle stared at this. Typed, "I hate that you're right." Then closed the email and called to Seattle. 40 minutes later, she opened a new document, titled it, Compass Framework, External Applications, Version 1. Began typing. Because that was what Noelle did. She finished one thing and began the next before the first thing had finished celebrating, which was its kind of faith in the future. Patricia Holt did not know any of this was happening. She had not been following Compass with any consistency. She was aware the company existed, aware it was growing. She had heard it mentioned in the break room and found reasons to be elsewhere. She had enough to carry without adding more. The morning she bought the ticket was a Sunday in March. 3 years and 6 months after a Tuesday in September that she still thought about every day. Sometimes just... The way you thought about something that had permanently rearranged who you were. She had a work trip to Denver. The hotel had booked her on a different carrier, and she had quietly asked if she could switch within the same budget range. She could. She booked the Compass flight before she could change her mind.
Economy class. Row 24. Middle seat. Which felt correct in a way she did not examine too closely. She packed a small bag. She had gotten good at traveling light. The airport was familiar in the way airports were when you had worked in them for decades. The acoustic, the light, the specific energy of thousands of people all going somewhere. She had loved this energy once. She still found it something different now. But something. She joined the Compass boarding line. The gold agent took her pass and smiled in the way of someone and actually glad to see another human being at the gate. She moved down the jet bridge and stepped onto the aircraft. The flight attendant at the door was perhaps 30, easy posture. The expression of someone genuinely presents rather than performing presence. Good morning, welcome to Compass. Not a script, just a welcome. She found row 24. Sat on 24B, middle seat, narrow in exactly the way all little seats had always been narrow. Physical comfort was still allocated by space. That had not changed. But before departure, the flight attendant came through the cabin and stopped at her row without being asked. Long trip for anyone today? The woman in 24A said she was going home after 3 weeks away. The man in 24C said first flight since a health scare 18 months ago. Patricia said, first flight in a while. The attendant nodded at each of them separately, like 3 distinct answers to 3 distinct people. We're glad you're all here, he said, and moved on. Patricia sat back. She had expected something more demonstrative, some visible announcement of difference. The difference was not loud. It was the 3 extra seconds, the question without agenda, the specific experience of being heard rather than processed, small, precise, and somehow the whole thing. The woman in 24A introduced herself. Dolores, 68 years old, returning from 3 weeks with her daughter in Atlanta, mother to 3 children, including one universally known as Bean, whose photograph she witnessed immediately and with complete confidence it's to be well received. It was well received. Bean was an excellent name for a baby. You fly much? Dolores asked. I used to, Patricia said. Not for a while. Me either. I stopped after a bad experience years ago. An area that made me feel like I was something they had to manage. She said it without drama. Just a fact. Patricia held it. What made you try again? My daughter kept saying Compass was different. I said, prove it. Dolores smiled. Show me a ticket. So here I am. And is it? Patricia asked. Different? Dolores thought about it seriously. The young man said, we're glad you're all here, and I believed him, she said. That's rare. I didn't know how rare until just now when I realized I actually believed him without having to work out whether I was supposed to. The aircraft pushed back. Patricia watched the tarmac through the window. The ground crew in orange vests, the precise choreography of departure. She had watched this on since thousands of times, from jet bridges, from behind counters. She had never once watched it with nothing to do but notice. They were 40 minutes into the flight when the flight attendant came down the aisle and stopped at verse 18. A quiet exchange with a woman seated there. Then he walked back the forward rows and said something to a small girl sitting with her mother, maybe 10 years old, reading something thick and battered. Her mother nodded. The girl stood and followed the attendant toward the front of the plane. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a child being invited somewhere. Patricia watched the curtain settle. She thought about what was through it, through first class, through the door at the front of the aircraft. That walked 4,000 times in a uniform she no longer owned. She thought about a 10-year-old girl going somewhere no one had told her she was not allowed to go. Dolores was watching too. That's what my daughter meant, she said quietly. Patricia did not answer right away. She was thinking about the engineering of the moment. How it had not been designed as a gesture, how it had been designed as a default, the normal thing. What happened when a system had built human curiosity into its assumptions, rather than into an exception that needed to be managed? You could not fake that, could not mandate it from outside by policy or memo. It could only come from building an institution on different assumptions about what people deserved before they had done anything to demonstrate they deserved it. She thought about 11 words said on a jet bridge, in a practiced tone, the inheritance of a system she had served for 22 years, without ever asking what the serving looked like from the other side. The girl came back from the cockpit 20 minutes later, walked down the aisle to her seat. Her face was the face of a child who had been shown something that had permanently expanded her understanding of what was possible for her. Patricia recognized that face. She had been wearing something close to it since boarding. They landed in Denver at 2:47 in afternoon. Everyone stood immediately, because everyone always did. Patricia let the row empty ahead of her. The flight attendants were at the door as she passed. The young man nodded, the real nod. She nodded back, walked up to jet bridge, stepped into the terminal, stopped. The accumulated weight of its way to the and flies arriving all at once in the space where there was finally room for it to land. Her phone buzzed. One text, unknown number. Saw you on the plane. I'm glad you came. She read it. Read it again. Area coded 17, Cambridge. Noelle. Noelle had been on this flight, had recognized her at boarding, had said nothing on the jet bridge, nothing during 2 hours and 40 minutes in the air, nothing during deplaning, had waited until Patricia had landed, till the experience was complete and on her own, until it could not be contaminated by the knowledge of something observed, and then, I saw you. I'm glad you came. Not, I forgive you. Not, now we're even. Not, look how far we've all come. Just, I saw you. I'm glad. Patricia stood in Denver International and cried. Not the contained professional management of feeling. Not the private sitting in the drop of tertiary with for one small bag and her manager's meeting and no particular reason to be standing in this specific spot. She cried because of the girl in row 16 with the rearranged face. Because Dolores had believed the young man and not had to work for it. Because Noelle Ibarra had given her the gift of not being watched. She cried because she was 54 years old and was finally understanding things she should have understood at 30. At the beginning of the 22 years, at any point during them, she cried because the cost of not understanding was not abstract. It was paid by actual people whose hundred faces she could still see if she tried. She cried because it was not too late. Not for institutions, not for individuals, not even for her. She wiped her face, stood straight, typed back. Thank you for letting me see it first, sent it. Put her phone in her pocket, picked up her bag, and walked toward the exit. She did not look back at the gate. She did not need to. She knew. What was there, she had just been on it. Back in Cambridge, Noelle read the reply. Set her phone face down on her desk, looked at her screen for a moment, then went back to typing. Because the gesture had been made and received, and that was what gestures were for. Not to be extended into ceremony. It was enough. Exactly enough. She kept typing. The new document was now 12 pages. External applications. The framework for organizational airlines had never been airlines and were sitting somewhere right now reading a 40-page paper and thinking I have this exact problem and I didn't know it had a solution. Selene called when she got back to her office. How many now? Noelle checked. 89,000. Six figures tonight, I know. The school superintendent in Ohio. I read her letter. Twice. Noelle leaned back. Solid? If you build the environment before the habits form, we could actually. Are you in? Solzen, though, at her office window, the river outside doing the slow, deliberate thing it did in March, moving like something that had stopped being in a hurry. Yes, she said. I'm in. Noelle made a sound that was several things simultaneously. Satisfaction, momentum, beginning of something. I'm going to need mail tabs. You always need mail tabs. This one might need 60. Noelle. There'll be sub-tabs. Selene laughed. The low, genuine one she kept for things that were both funny and true at the same time. She hung up, sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, thought about a Tuesday morning's term supper, about a boarding gate and 11 words, about the 3 years between that morning and this afternoon, about the 47 tabs and the whiteboard and the rewire and the scenes.
And I give him a deadline instead.
About the paper now in the hands of 89,000 people who had not known they were looking for it. About her mother's handwriting, the note card in her kitchen drawer in Cambridge. The function of freedom is to free someone else. She had been 23 when her mother wrote it out for her. She thought she understood then, the way you understood something before it had happened to you. She understood it differently now. Not more, not deeper, just differently. Well, behold, just as her mind. She stood, put on her coat, turned off the light, and walked out into the grey Cambridge afternoon, carrying nothing heavier than what came next. Edmund, at the same hour, received a phone call. He was still in its conference room, the whiteboard still in front of him. Year 0 in the corner. Trust the design fading slightly, the way things faded when they had done their work. The number on his phone was one he'd been expecting. Mr. Barbara, my name is Thomas Beckett, Operations Director for a regional hospital group in Minnesota. I've spent the last 4 hours reading your daughter's paper and the framework her sister published this morning. I have a board meeting in 3 weeks to talk about whether what you built can be built somewhere else. Edmund looked at the whiteboard at year 0. Mr. Beckett, he said, everything we built can be built somewhere else. That was always the point. He pulled his chair out, sat down, and began again.